Great. Yeah. Okay. So I'll begin. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode at Giri's Adda. And this happens to be the 96th episode. Though I must say that I've not been really regular. I've been coming here whenever, I fancy coming here. But today we have a we have lined up a very interesting conversation. And before I get to that conversation, a few words about Giri's Adda, which is, for the benefit of those friends and colleagues who may not have seen this Adda earlier. Basically, this Adda was set up to do three things: to do books, which we are going to be doing today, to sing songs, and there are a lot of songs on the Adda that you can listen to, and to have conversations, all in the hope that this will contribute to a better world. So that's the very small and modest objective of this online space. We have a very interesting person here who also happens to be a dear friend of mine. Karthik Venkatesh, welcome to Giri's Adda, and
Hi,
happy
hi,
that
Giri.
yeah,
Very happy to be here at Giri's Adda, which I occasionally listen into, mostly to your
absolutely
songs, but I have caught a couple of conversations as well.
wonderful. So I'm going to be talking a little about you, Karthik, before I get to your book. And in fact, let me show our friends here what we will be talking about today. Is this very wonderful book which both Karthik and I are holding. It's a slim book, as you can see. It's all about 140 pages, but the book packs a punch, and it's about a very interesting topic of language, and I'll get to it, in a bit. But let me tell you a little bit about Karthik, and I think there are some very interesting tidbits about him. First of all, Karthik is from Bangalore. He was born and brought up in Bangalore. And the interesting fact is that Karthik and I probably spent our childhood within half a kilometer of each other in Bangalore's Tasker town, very close to Shivaji Nagar, very close to Queen's Road. So uh, whenever I see and meet Karthik, I'm reminded of old Bangalore days. Uh, Karthik also grew up in what I would call a multilingual environment, where he had the occasion to learn Tamil, Malayalam, of course, English, and then Kannada. Very interestingly, Deccani, which I would like probably him to talk a little about. And Deccani is not the same as Urdu, I believe. It's slightly different, probably even older. And that's an interesting part. Uh, Hindi. The other interesting part is he tried learning French, but he failed. And I'm not too sure why that happened. Maybe he can tell us. Uh, Following all of that, following his childhood and so on, somehow he meandered into doing an MBA. And after that, very interestingly, he got into the field of education, where he did his course in postgraduate course in education from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. We'll ask him to talk a little about that. Karthik writes whenever he feels like writing, and I mean, if he can churn out a book whenever he feels like, I'm not, I'm sure if he starts really writing regularly, there'll be much more that we can see from him. Now, the last bit is that during the weekdays he runs in the morning, and on weekends he naps. But today he's awake for us. We hope so, and he's going to take part in this. He's going to take part in this session with us. So that's my little bit of a tongue-in-cheek introduction to Karthik. So Karthik, tell us. Let me begin by asking a very simple, basic question. How did you get to this wonderful book, 10 Indian languages and how they came to be? Tell us a little bit about that story that got you here.
So I think I should give credit to my parents for seeding questions about languages in my head, and I'll
Okay.
explain. Both my parents had a hand to play in this. Years ago, when we lived in Chennai, my mother told me that I had to speak Tamil outside
Okay.
the door of our house. I had to speak a different Tamil if I wanted to
Okay.
make myself understood. And I was about
Okay.
5 or 6 years old then, and I didn't understand what she meant by a different Tamil. Essentially,
Mm-hmm.
what she was telling me was that the Tamil that we spoke at home, right, was very different from the Tamil that was spoken in the world outside the home. Though both these
Okay.
languages were technically Tamil, they had the same
Okay.
name. The Tamil that
Okay.
we spoke at home had
Mm-hmm.
uh, a fair bit of Malayalam in it. For
Mm-hmm.
certain historical reasons, my ancestors moved from Tamil Nadu to Kerala, and so
Mm-hmm.
we'd been in Kerala for hundreds of years. And so, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
while we continue to speak Tamil, the linguistic environment outside, obviously made its influence felt, and Malayalam entered the language. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very natural. When we speak it, we're obviously not thinking about what is the Tamil word and what is the Malayalam word. We just use
Correct.
what naturally comes to us. So
Right.
that was perhaps the first thing that kind of got me curious when I come to think
Okay.
of it, that I had to speak the same language, same in quotes, differently. I had to speak a
Okay.
different language at home, and I had to consciously speak a different language outside. So that was
But you
influence
must
number
have
one.
you must have realized this. It must have hit you subconsciously at that point of time.
I guess so. I was
Yeah.
very young, but yeah,
Yeah.
but then you try to do what you're told, and so
Mm.
and then you kind of end up thinking about it maybe years later. What
Yeah.
did that mean? That was
Yeah.
influence number one. The influence number two was my father. So my father
Mm-hmm.
grew up in Ujjain, in Madhya Pradesh,
Okay.
and he studied in Hindi medium. Right up to
Okay.
class 10, he studied Hindi medium. And so this was the 50s, when all these great debates about Shuddh Hindi and Hindustani and Urdu and all of these things were happening. And Madhya Pradesh
Right.
being a Hindi speaking region, much of these debates were happening. And so he had these ideas,
Okay.
about what is Hindi, what is Urdu. And he also introduced this word to me, which I understood only later, that no,
Mm-hmm.
the language of Bollywood films is neither Hindi nor Urdu, it is Hindustani. You know,
Oh.
so
Okay.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so because Hindi is heavily Sanskritized, Urdu is heavily Persianized, but
Okay.
Bollywood uses neither a very heavily Sanskritized idiom nor a heavily Persianized idiom. It uses something in
Mm-hmm.
between, which is
Mm-hmm.
Hindustani. Which the
Mm-hmm.
credit for which naming which goes to Gandhiji. So
Okay.
my dad kind of put all these things into me. What is Hindi? What is Urdu? What is Hindustani? So that was influence number two. So
Okay.
these casual conversations about languages with my parents kind
Right.
of took me forward, made me interested. I started reading about it and so on. And that's where the idea for this book was perhaps seeded many years ago.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, before we move forward, I want to quickly tell our friends here that this slim book packs a punch, as I said. Uh, Karthik, for reasons known best to him, and he's going to tell us, he's chosen 10 Indian languages, starting from Tamil, Telugu, Brahui, which are the Dravidian languages. Then he moves on to what are called the Austro-Asiatic languages of Santali and Khasi. Then the Sino-Tibetan languages, there's a third classification or cluster where he talks about Kok Borok and Manipuri. And then finally, he talks about Indo-Aryan languages of Marathi, Punjabi, and Hindi. But interestingly, apart from that, he's also talking about what he calls as Nagamese, and he tells us a little bit of the story of Brahmi and the story of English. Now, what I liked about this book is I think it's an excellent work of exposition. And Karthik, my understanding is you wanted to bring the issue of language right onto the conversation at the dinner table or in living rooms. So, this is a book that's actually meant for a very wide audience of consisting of students, young people, parents, teachers, and anybody who's interested in languages. But very importantly, it's also a work of history. So, this is something that I liked. And one of the most fascinating things I found was on page 30, which I'm going to show you right now, where if you can just see this, there's this beautiful exhibit about the evolution, or the snapshot of how Tamil, right from the 3rd century BC till the 19th century, how that script has evolved. So there are these fascinating historical insights. And before we continue the conversation, I just want to read maybe one or two uh, uh, tidbits which really got me excited about this book. So on page 17, Karthik narrates this whole story about what happens when languages die, and we will get to that point in this conversation with him. And there is an interesting a bit of information here. uh, when and I'm going to read this from the book. When Thak Bahadur Majhi died in the Joretan district of Sikkim in 2016, a language died with him. So, for someone who is coming to this discussion about language for the very first time, this is a very fascinating question. Why do languages die? How do languages die? And so on. And I'm moving quickly on to something even more fascinating. On page 23, sorry, yeah, on page 46, where he talks about a language called Brahui. And I was not aware of this earlier. uh, this is a Dravidian language which is found in Pakistan, in in Balochistan, which also happens to be one of the largest provinces of Pakistan. Did you even imagine that a Dravidian language could be spoken there? Because we are all brought up on a diet of history, that talks about the Dravidian language being limited to the peninsula and downwards. And here you have some very fascinating insights about how languages travel. And I think this is something that we would want Karthik to talk about. So, with those two little bit of reading from the book, I want to take this conversation forward. Uh, Karthik, we also know that apart from those very interesting childhood experiences that you're talking about, later on, you did engage very seriously with education itself. And was there anything in that experience uh, that helped you along in this journey, which has eventually resulted in this book?
I mean, I think a lot of credit for seeding many of the ideas into this book goes to our professor, whom we I think had the privilege of studying under, Professor Ramakant Agnihotri, who taught us in the Tata Institute of Social
Yes.
Science, and
Yeah.
I think it was a great learning experience, studying linguistics under him. He
Hmm.
provided, I think, the framework,
Hmm.
which kind of led to a very a disciplined journey into the world of languages. He provided that kind of foundation, that kind of way of thinking, that kind of perspective, which was very, very, very influential in how I pursued, my quest to understand more about languages and origins and histories and so on.
Right. Right.
Because many of the I mean, when we entered that course, what we had obviously some suspicions, some misunderstandings, right, and a great deal of interest. And that course kind of sorted out your suspicions, cleared your misunderstandings, and then that great deal of interest, it just completely propelled it into another sphere. And that's how this journey became even more intense for me. I was always
Mm.
interested in languages, like I told you, for various personal reasons. But now, with an academic understanding of languages, I decided that I needed to pursue it more seriously, purely out of personal interest, not because I wanted to write a book at that point in time, because I had questions and ideas and things that I wanted to understand. So I
Right.
think, in some sense, this book is my tribute to those wonderful classes, which I
Right.
had such a privilege to be a part of.
I wish we were in a position to invite Professor Ramakant into this conversation, but unfortunately, that's not to be right now. But we do hope to get to Professor Ramakant Agnihotri, who is also one of India's foremost linguists, having taught for long years in the Delhi University. And I think Professor Ramakant was also involved in the early days of the Hoshangabad science teaching program, and Eklavya later, which at that time was one of the most pioneering education NGOs that started in the early 80s. So that's a very fascinating thing. But tell us a little more about how did this book get conceptualized, and how did you, I mean, if we say that India is a land of hundreds of languages, and of course, right from the British times, people tried to survey how many languages were there in, or probably even pre-British, I suppose, and till today. So our understanding of, the number of languages that are used in India is that there's a huge number there. How did you end up choosing these 10 out of that? And can you tell a little bit about the book writing process? How long did it take? When did you start working on it?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, it's a monumental task to be writing about 1,000 languages, which is more or less the number of languages that we have in India. So, yeah. So, how I chose to kind of figure out how many languages to write about, or which are the languages I wanted to write about, was
Hmm.
broadly India has five families of languages, right? The Indo-Aryan, the Dravidian, the Austroasiatic, the Sino-Tibetan, and the Andamanese. Now, the Andamanese family of languages is something that has only come to light a couple of decades ago. Professor
Hmm.
Anvita Abbi has done a
Okay.
great deal of work on Andamanese languages, and she has kind of made the case for them being a separate family. So the
Right.
Andamanese languages are still, what can I say, a work in progress. So I thought it's perhaps too early to be writing about the Andamanese languages.
Hmm.
And so I said, okay, I would want to write about languages chosen from the other four families. And I made the decision to choose three from the Indo-Aryan and three from the Dravidian families of languages, simply because between these two languages, roughly 95% of India's speakers belong to
Right.
one of the two, right?
Right.
Indo-Aryan is by far the majority. It's about
Correct.
72% of Indian speakers. Dravidian is about 20-22%.
Right.
So I thought writing about three languages each from these two families was the best thing I could do. And then
Okay.
I also thought it's important to write about Austroasiatic languages and Sino-Tibetan languages because they're not in our consciousness as much. For
Hmm.
instance, very few people have heard of a language called Kokborok. And
Kokborok,
Kokborok is
yes.
an official language in Tripura. It's spoken by roughly 1 million people there. Another
Hmm.
3 4 thousand 3 4 300 400,000 people speak Kokborok in Bangladesh. So roughly we
Wow.
are talking about say 1.2 or 1.3 million people were speaking that language, but nobody's even heard that language.
Right.
And for instance, now Santali, an Austroasiatic language, India's largest spoken tribal language.
Right.
Which Santali speakers, according to the 2011 census, number about 7.3 million. 73
Okay.
lakh. It's a huge
Right.
number. So, so the idea was to write about things, write about languages that we know about or know something about, but also introduce the reader to languages that you don't know anything about. So a mix of the
Right.
familiar and the unfamiliar. That was what I
Right.
was aiming for.
Okay, wonderful. So I think it was that. I mean, obviously, you had to make a selection because, as you said, the number of languages is too intimidating for you to be writing. And in any case, some of those details are available in linguistic surveys. For
Absolutely.
example, the People's Linguistic Survey of India, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So yeah, okay, okay, great. I want to take you uh, into a few more questions which are of course biased from my own upbringing, and my own experiences and the baggage that I carry as somebody who works in the field of education. But then, since language is quite central to education, uh, and we often talk of language in education, and we talk of language and education, they're all very very closely related to each other. Let me begin uh, by asking this question about, and I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes about this whole thing of language and dialect. How do you how do you see this question? So people people seem to place dialect at a lower level of importance than language, and so on. So can we begin with that discussion?
Sure. See, a dialect, the understanding, the popular understanding of dialect is basically two things. It could mean a language without a script, right?
Hmm.
That is one understanding. The second thing is it could also mean a slightly different form of a known language, say Bangla or Tamil or Kannada or
Right.
whichever languages. So there is a standard Bangla which we know, or a standard Tamil or a standard Kannada that we recognize, and there are languages that are more or less like the standard, but they have certain fundamental differences. You know,
Hmm.
they have certain expressions, they have certain pronunciations, they have
Right.
certain ways of sentence construction. So that's
Hmm.
our broadly our understanding about dialects. Now,
Hmm.
when you say dialect, so you're talking about something of a deviation, right? So there is a standard which you have, and a dialect differs from the standard.
Okay.
So now the question, therefore, is what is this standard? How did it come to be? Who made
Right.
it the standard, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So why is the language spoken, the Hindi that is spoken in Bihar, not the standard?
Not the
And why
standard.
is the yeah, why is the Hindi spoken in Delhi the standard?
Or
Right? So
Varanasi or wherever. Yeah.
wherever, right?
Yeah.
Why is one thing the standard? Why is one thing the not the standard? And it's all historical accident. Right?
Hmm.
Something becomes the standard purely by chance. Some in an alternate universe, something else could be the standard, right?
But
So
isn't it also about politics? And I want you to
it is
come back
about
to that
politics. It's about
later.
power. It's
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
power. It's about politics. It's about what can I say? Who Murphy's golden rule. Whoever
Yeah.
has the gold makes the rules, right?
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
so it's about things like that.
Hmm.
So when you understand that a dialect became a dialect purely by chance, or a standard language became a standard language purely by chance, you realize that this distinction between standard language and dialect is very artificial. It's very superficial. It's very very vague.
Hmm.
It's like the difference between a mountain and a hill.
Right. Yeah.
What is a mountain and what is a hill? You know,
Hmm.
is there a height consideration here? Sometimes very tall mountains are called hills, and
Hills. Yeah.
sometimes very not so tall hills are called mountains, right?
Mountains. Okay.
So these are just terms, but in our popular understanding, a mountain is big, a hill is small, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But the evidence, when you look at geography, does not quite indicate that. You know, like I said, some hills are bigger than mountains, taller than mountains, and some mountains are shorter than hills. So given
True.
that dialect and standard language, they are, I mean, they are ideas that are useful, but not ideas that we should take very very seriously. You know, a standard
Right.
language
Yeah.
is not set in stone. 100 200 years later, something else can become the standard language because of Murphy's golden rule.
Correct. Correct. Um, uh, but a related question here would be, why is it that the things that we call dialects have ended up not having a script? Is there any historical reason for it? Or is this again, like you said, related to power, and who was the character or set of characters who were pushing some
See,
things and
most of
not pushing
the
some things?
virtually all many of the Austroasiatic and Sino-Tibetan languages did not have a script till the 19th century, right?
Okay.
The circumstances of its speakers were such that a script was not deemed necessary. You know, there were other ways in which they communicated. You know, through drawings, through play acting, through various rituals, and so on.
Okay.
So a script is of course very very important, and it's very very useful, but at the same time, it's a process in the evolution that's not necessary for every language. Some languages just maybe choose to skip that stage or come to it later than other languages. It's about
Right.
how the civilization kind of evolves, and
Hmm.
which direction it takes, and therefore recording language becomes important. It becomes important to some languages. It's not so important for other languages. it's
Hmm.
it's all
Hmm.
the vagaries of history.
Hmm. But then having a script also probably privileges that. I mean, if a dialect were to develop a script, it would privilege that dialect because then you can start entering other spaces. For example,
Yeah,
education
it
becomes a
enables
space where you,
transmission. It
yeah,
enables variety of, like you're saying, entering
hmm,
new, fresh new spaces. See,
right,
language is a medium of communication.
correct,
So you choose to communicate only in certain spheres, but when you
yeah,
have to choose to when you choose to enter newer spheres, you have to
right,
then ideate your language differently. You have to think about your language differently. You have to think about, developing a script and so on. Now, for instance, now you want to teach. Historically, in India, for instance, technical education has been taught in English.
yeah, yeah,
But if you want to teach it in a regional language, Hindi
yeah,
or Tamil or whatever, then the language has to develop a vocabulary for it. It's
correct,
a choice that you make.
yeah,
Various technical terms in English have then to be translated into Hindi or Kannada or Tamil or Bengali.
right.
So it's a choice. So then the language has to develop that kind of
Mm.
vocabulary.
That requires a
So
lot of hard work in any case. Yeah,
it's a lot of work. It's a lot of
yeah.
work.
Mm, mm, mm.
Now, for
You
instance,
also, yeah,
the word globalization is an English word, right?
yeah.
Now, in Hindi, a term "bhu mandali karan" was
Oh
created for
God.
that word. For globalization.
I mean, and while that sounds as complicated as globalization, I think for the first time it definitely is daunting.
It is, but once
Yeah.
you read it and you
Once
read it
you
in context, you become very comfortable with it. It's
you
like
become
learning a new word
comfortable.
in English. You'll
Yeah.
see this new word you've never seen before, and you're like
Yeah.
taken aback. But then
Yeah.
once you understand it, you understand its context, you understand its meaning, you'll probably start using the word very quickly.
Correct, correct. But then I think I must also, taking off from what you're saying, I think a more recent development, which is particularly associated with the current central government of our country, is this attempt to uh, provide higher education or technical education, including engineering education, in the regional language.
Languages,
Uh,
yeah.
though, of course, I don't think that has gone off very well, and there are challenges and there are few takers for it, but then there is
Yeah.
certainly an attempt to kind of use the regional language for that, and we need to see where that attempt will go in the
Yeah,
future.
where it will go. The market will perhaps determine,
True, true.
where this
Absolutely.
experiment will go or how far it can possibly go.
Absolutely. The other thing that I caught when you were, mentioning, talking about language and dialect is this whole uh, term that you use, the standard language. And there is a standard, and the dialect gets measured against that standard. When you use the term standard, did you also mean pure language or the pure version of that language? Is that what you had in mind? Or
That's
is the
how we
pure.
understood.
Okay.
Standard is pure,
Mhm.
non-standard is not so pure, or non-standard is dialect.
Is
But
mixed,
then
yeah.
that word pure is an odd sort of word. I mean, what do you mean by pure?
Yeah, and I,
You
my question to you is there, is it a myth, or is there a pure language that is existing that we must all drink from or use? No.
what interesting
It's
analogy.
like the nectar.
Okay, now, so the question is now, there are ways of looking at pure. Now, let's look at pure, for instance, as purely the standard language. So, the
Yeah,
standard language has a standard spelling, a standard grammar, a standard way of expression.
yeah,
So, yeah, so that is one way of looking at pure. So, a sentence has to be written in a certain way, right?
yeah,
Or
yeah.
spellings
Okay.
have to be in a certain way. So, that's one way of looking at pure.
One way of looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah, then there's another way of looking at pure is in the sense, the words that you're using, are they are they from your own language, or are you borrowing it from other languages? For
Hmm.
instance, I mean, the best example of this would be French. French
Okay.
is extremely conscious of not wanting to borrow words from other
From any
languages,
other
especially
language.
English.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Académie Française, they actually have a process of allowing words into French. When
Oh,
I mean
okay.
allowing words, I mean putting it in the dictionary.
Right.
That is what I
So they
mean
have
by
to
allowing.
go through a rite of passage. So
You
to say.
have to go to a rite of passage, and sometimes words are not allowed. They are not put in the
Okay.
dictionary, even though
Oh,
people may be using it, right?
very
Even though
interesting.
people may be
Hmm.
using it informally. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the point. So this process of allowing words, allowing, not allowing words, that's a very interesting process or way of trying to maintain purity. But then if you kind of start looking at all the words that are in your language, many of the words have come from many other languages, and you
Right.
don't even realize where they have come from.
Correct.
So that the whole purity debate then kind of falls flat when
Mm-hmm.
some word was entered the language 500 or 700 or 800 years ago, and it's there, but you
Mm-hmm.
don't want to use, you don't want to allow a word today to come from another language. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because of some idea or some notion of what you think is purity. Hmm.
Mm-hmm. I think it's
So
somewhere I realized, I was, if I were to quote from my own, from personal experience, my mother tongue is Marathi, right? But it's not the Marathi that you would hear in Pune or Bombay or maybe other parts of Maharashtra. It's a very,
non-standard
very
Marathi.
non-standard Marathi, and I used to face a lot of flack for it from friends and even relatives at some point of time. Not of course my relatives who spoke the same language, but then there were others who said. And in Kannada, there's a very derogatory term used to describe the Marathi that I speak. They call it Koli Marathi for some reason. It's almost like hens cackling because koli means a hen or whatever it is in Kannada. And I would always feel so what, this is my language, and this is the way I speak it, and I'm able to express every emotion that you are capable of expressing in this language. So what is the problem? So are you therefore then saying, Karthik, that the idea of pure language is a myth?
The idea of pure language is a myth, and I mean, there's this saying that I have quoted in the book, and I want to read from that.
Yeah, yeah, please do, please do.
Right? कोस कोस पर बदले पानी, चार कोस पर वाणी. Right? So
Hmm.
every few miles the water changes,
Yeah.
right? And every few miles again the language changes, because no language is unchanged over a wide geographical area.
Right.
Variations enter the language. So therefore, there is no such thing as a pure language. Beyond a few kilometers, people speak the language a little differently. And a few
Hmm.
kilometers beyond that, the difference kind of grows. So when you get from point A to point B, you've gone through different linguistic zones, and this language sounds very different from this language, right?
And it's only
But
very
they're broadly
natural
the
for
same.
that to happen. Yeah.
But they're broadly the same.
Hmm.
So therefore, purity is a strange thing to be applied to language,
Hmm.
because there are bound to be variations, there are bound to be differences in pronunciation, there are bound to be differences in vocabulary, there are bound to be differences in accent, as a result of the various influences that a language subsists and thrives in. It's as
Right.
simple as that.
But then,
Hmm.
do you also see this sort of distinction, so to say, emerging because of the issues of social domination, social and political domination? That look, I belong to a community that speaks the pure language, and you're the guy who is impure, you're the guy who is mixed, and therefore, I'm at a higher level somewhere in that pecking order or that hierarchy. Is that also one of the reasons as to why this
I think
even comes up?
that is largely the reason. Some certain groups seeking supremacy, certain groups seeking, what can I say, domination over the other groups, and
Hmm.
you do it in various ways. And language is one of your weapons, apart from say economics or other kinds of weapons. Language is also one of the weapons. Because
Hmm.
I am higher because I speak a purer language. You're
Right.
lower because you speak a not so pure language.
Not so pure language. Yeah.
Yeah.
But how is this related? I mean, the other question that comes to mind is, how is this related to something such as, the big problem that we have seen historically also about what is perceived as a domination of Hindi or an imposition of Hindi over the rest of the country. And I definitely feel, that there's a lot of misconception amongst a lot of people who believe that Hindi is a national language, which it isn't. And we're
which
very
it
sure
isn't.
that,
Yeah, and
yeah, it is
that
only an
point needs
official
to be made
language.
again and again,
Yeah,
simply because the constitution says that it isn't. The constitution
it
does not
isn't.
provide for a national language.
Absolutely.
So that's the fact. No,
Yeah.
but I also, I mean, I want to start by saying this and saying this very clearly. I think Hindi is a wonderful language, right?
Right.
I read Hindi very well. I really enjoy, reading Hindi and speaking in Hindi and so on. But you have burdened the language with all these national language kind of, burdens, which actually kind of prevents other people from discovering the language,
Yeah.
because you don't want to go, you don't want to learn that language for political reasons. You actually have nothing against the language itself. No,
No, no,
what's a
absolutely
language?
not.
Language is
Yeah,
merely a way of expression. So
absolutely.
yeah, so given that, right, given that you are actually, Hindi is such a wonderful language, and I think everyone who's interested should learn it.
Hmm.
By giving it this whole national color, right, you're actually doing an injustice to it. You should,
Hmm.
allow people to dip their toes into that language very naturally,
Correct.
uh,
Correct.
instead of trying to forcefully mandate that everyone should know the language.
True. 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 Yeah.
Forceful measures of this sort rarely ever work,
Yeah. Yeah. And we
especially,
see a lot of backlash
yeah,
to
and
to
emotive
those.
issues like language,
Yeah.
they rarely ever work. And
Yeah.
then actually the what can I say, the possibility that people would have learned the language quite naturally also kind of vanishes. and
Hmm.
uh, and I think that's the problem.
Hmm. Hmm.
In
Hmm.
some sense, actually, Hindi has spread very quietly, organically, you know
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. I mean,
nationally.
I think Bollywood is one big engine of that
Of
spreading, which
that,
all of us love.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And from Kanyakumari to Kashmir, from Gujarat, right down to Nagaland,
Yeah.
uh, there are people who can kind of understand Hindi well, a smattering of it, Hindi
Yeah.
words,
Yeah.
stuff like that. So it has actually quite quietly spread. The imposition actually hasn't helped.
It
The
hasn't
imposition
helped.
has actually prevented it from spreading in some sense.
Yeah. In fact, this reminds me of a very interesting statement I heard. I had an opportunity many years ago to do some research work in Andaman and Nicobar, and those days I used to travel to Port Blair, very often, and speaking to locals there, people in Port Blair. Uh, I often used to hear this statement, which I found very fascinating, that probably Port Blair is one of the very few places in India, or the only place, where you will find two Tamilians talking to each other in Hindi,
Hmm, hmm,
because it was also seen as a melting pot in some
hmm, hmm,
sense,
hmm.
and I found it so beautiful, that that this was happening without any coercion, and it was happening probably because it was thought as the most functionally efficient kind of way to communicate, and so on and
Communicate.
so forth. Yeah.
Now, the Hindi is also the de facto lingua franca in Arunachal Pradesh. The various
Okay.
tribes of Arunachal Pradesh, who all speak different languages, many of
Okay.
which are not mutually intelligible.
Okay.
Now, it is Hindi that is common to all of them.
Okay. This
So
is
it
interesting.
happens very
Okay.
organically.
Yeah. This is that something like a bridge language,
Absolutely, absolutely.
which English also plays a big role in across our entire country as of today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
English perhaps for various historical reasons plays that big bridge role among the elite. you know
Elite. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
whereas Hindi could possibly play that bridge role among the non-elite.
Non-elite. And
Yeah.
that I think takes me to another very interesting question that I want you to reflect on. And this is again, rooted in the domain of education, and there are going to be a couple of questions that I have here. One is, if you look at uh, the national education policy of 2020, if you look at earlier pronouncements, policy pronouncements and so on. If you look at the right to education, for example, of 2010 and so on, uh, they all talk about instruction in the mother tongue. Of course, the right to education falls short by saying as far as possible, so it doesn't make it a decree. So that's where I think they have avoided, taking the mother tongue issue head on. Um but then the NEP very interestingly talks about, and we've heard, uh, you know, the central government, including the prime minister, also talk about, learning in the mother tongue and so on. So that is one part of it. Uh, but then when you closely look at the approaches in several states, there is this very strong movement towards English medium, as the instruction, right? Including, of course, in government schools. So I can think of examples from Andhra Pradesh, one of the first few states. I can think of Telangana. Up north, I can think of Jammu Kashmir, which, had a nightmarish path in terms of introducing English as medium
Mhm.
in schools, and many other states. I'm sure, we can count that number, and that number is going to be quite large. How do you see, these impulses playing out? And I mean, is that the best way of going about it, or is it now irreversible and nothing can be done?
I think that cusp point where market forces and what can I say, cultural forces are both acting, and in some sense
Mhm.
there is no resolution. This whole move towards English medium education, even in government schools, is largely the pressure of market forces.
Mhm.
Parents often want their children to know English because
Right.
English is the language of opportunity. English is the language of higher education. English is the language of corporate India. English is the language of the judiciary, the bureaucracy. So they believe, and rightly so, I would say, that knowing English opens the doors to employment in all of these
Correct.
spaces.
Correct.
So that is the market, and that's acting, and that's forcing people to think in a certain way. Then there
Right.
are the pedagogical issues of, and this is proven without doubt, that mother tongue education is the best way, to kind
Absolutely.
of
That is
take.
what a linguist or a person in education would probably swear by. Yeah.
Absolutely. So now the point is now, so then you have say mother tongue education because you believe that it is the best form of education. It is proven that it is the best form of education. So now coming to the point that it is government schools that are choosing to teach in English, teach in the
Hmm.
English medium. Now that brings us to another set of market forces, wherein which the children who stay in government schools are largely the children who cannot afford private schools.
Private schools.
And private schools are by and large English medium, right? So who are in government schools, therefore? It's the
Right.
poorest in our society.
Right.
And even the poorest in our society now have this very clear perception that, we will continue to be poor unless we have some knowledge of English. And
English.
the
Yeah.
pressure is coming from there.
Right. Right.
So now, how then can you reconcile these cultural forces and these
Yeah.
market forces?
Yeah.
Will you tell the poor, no, 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 you should study only in the mother tongue?
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
it is in a way telling them, no, you should remain poor. The
Right.
protecting the culture is your burden to carry. The middle class and those who are more privileged, who can afford a private English medium education, it doesn't really matter to us. Our
Right.
conscience is assuaged if you learn in the
Right.
mother tongue. So
Right.
I mean, that's not a tenable argument.
Hmm.
So I mean, and that's at the heart of it. So how do you
True.
reconcile? How do you explain? How do you think about these things? That's the
Right.
only way I think you can make sense of it.
And how do you end up not burdening the child or the teacher? Because um, I think it's commonsensical in terms of understanding how best it can happen. That a language cannot be taught unless the teacher, who's a central figure there, is himself or herself using that language.
Proficient, yeah.
So, and it needs to be somewhere in the air for that to happen.
Yeah,
So, of course,
absolutely.
there are things like bilingual textbooks and so on, but then,
Sure,
the
sure, you
feedback
can.
that I get from teachers and even children is, who wants to read both these pages? I mean, it's like a double whammy. You have to
Hmm.
read the page in Kannada or Telugu, and then again you have to read it in English.
English.
So, and you still don't end up using that language so much. So, I think it becomes an
Hmm.
educational nightmare of sorts, for children as well. Uh, Karthik, it'll be good if you can pick up some part of, something very interesting, something very important that you want to say from your book, and read it out to us, maybe a short paragraph or two, which I would leave it to you at this stage. Yeah.
Right. So not my favorite part necessarily. The entire book is my favorite part.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there are, there is this short section on page 12 on
Okay.
languages and scripts,
Right.
right? And since we've had a bit of interaction about that, I thought I'd read about it a little bit, right?
Sure.
So, therefore, this is how it starts. A script is a system evolved to record a language in a written form.
Right.
But since the spoken language came much before the written language, the connection between the script and the language is not as strong as we perceive it to be.
Mm-hmm.
A single language may be written in multiple scripts. For instance, Konkani is written in the Devanagari, Malayalam, Kannada, Roman, and Arabic scripts.
This is
And
fantastic. I
all,
mean, one.
yeah, and all languages can, with some adjustments, be written in a single script. Right?
Hmm.
Text messages typed on mobile phones often use the Roman script for Indian languages, right? And
Absolutely.
more or less understood. So this very close connection between script and language in our minds, we should kind of problematize that. We should not think too much about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
knowing a script is not the same as knowing a language, right? Because German, French, Spanish, English, Kokborok, and Khasi, they're all written in the Roman script.
Right.
But
Right.
so just because you know the script, you know your ABCD, doesn't mean you can understand what's written in these scripts. And sometimes
Absolutely.
the same language is written in different scripts.
Hmm.
Punjabi. In India,
Hmm.
it's written in the Gurmukhi script. In
Hmm.
Pakistan, it is written in the Shahmukhi script, which is very similar to the Urdu script.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Mm-hmm.
point is that languages and scripts are not so heavily connected as we think, right? And there is a story there, and like I said, many languages use different scripts, and that
Yeah.
was a prevailing situation for a long time.
Hmm.
Language used many scripts for a long
Mm-hmm.
time
Mm-hmm.
until printing came into the picture, when then you had to kind of standardize on one script,
Right.
and
Right.
that's when one script was chosen again for various political and social reasons, and the other
Right.
scripts that the language was written in were discarded.
Right. Fascinating. But then from what you're saying, is this also a possible way out for, I mean, since you're basically saying that any script can be used,
It can
uh,
with
you know,
adjustments.
I mean, in principle at least. So for those languages that we call as dialects, and you have of course clarified that. I mean, we've had this discussion earlier in the conversation. Uh, but the dialects has there been any move historically, therefore, to give dialects their due in terms of a script using this principle? Is there any such example?
For instance, Tulu had
Yeah.
its own script, right, which has
Okay.
fallen into disuse. And in
Okay.
recent years, there have been attempts to bring back the old script or
Right.
write Tulu in Kannada, in the Kannada script.
Right.
Khasi, for instance, which was not a written language, uses
Right.
the Roman script with
Okay.
certain adjustments, right?
Okay. Okay.
Uh, Konkani, though Malayalam, Arabic, etc., were used, Konkani has more or less standardized its use in Devanagari and Roman, right? So
Okay.
Konkani is by and large written in these two scripts right now.
Okay.
Kannada, while it is written in Kannada in Karnataka, right?
Hmm.
De facto, Konkani favors Devanagiri, and the
Hmm.
church favors the Roman script.
Hmm.
So, it's kind of standardizing even as we speak. So,
Hmm.
I mean, technically, all languages can be written, like I said, in the same script, you know.
Hmm.
But at the same time, there are, I mean, even scripts can become emotive issues. For
Correct.
instance, Gurumukhi, the script of Punjabi in India, is
Yeah.
associated with the Sikh gurus. Guru, it's
Right.
associated with the second Sikh guru, Guru Angad. And he is
Right.
said to have created the script. So, in such a situation, you cannot foresee anyone giving up that script and opting for another standard script, because
Correct.
there are deeper reasons for wanting to continue the use of that script. It's not
Right.
just to read.
Very emotive reasons also,
Or to have a
actually.
certain connection to a very important figure in their
Correct.
culture and in history.
Correct. 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 So one of the questions that a friend of mine was asking me when she got to know about this particular session is, her question was, do ask Karthik about pronunciation. uh, and I think this is something that again assumes importance in the domain of education and classroom teaching and so on. And I must supplement that. I had a very interesting meeting which was chaired by the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh some months ago.
Hmm.
And as we all know, he's a great champion of promoting English in schools, right? So Andhra is probably the only state now in India that is also looking at IB affiliation for government
Right?
schools. Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. The IB is very closely involved with the government of Andhra Pradesh to create that affiliation. Be interesting to see how that unfolds and what it brings for children and teachers. But in that meeting, he was very particular about how children pronounced words, and he was not very happy about what he was seeing on the ground on his various visits. So as somebody who's engaged with education and language in equal measure, how do you see this? Is pronunciation really important?
I mean, the one thing that comes to my mind is Jeffrey Boycott, and his cricket commentary. When I think
Okay.
many of us heard the way he said umpire and not umpire,
Right.
it was
But
it
we
was a
figured that
shocking
out. Yeah.
yeah, it was a shocking moment, that
Umpire.
this
Yeah.
Englishman,
Right.
this Englishman was mispronouncing a word, you know. So clearly, even pronunciations have backstories, right?
Right.
Just as languages and dialects have backstories.
Yeah.
So why certain people pronounce certain things a certain way, is because of certain local conditions, and ultimately language is transmitted, or language was for a long time transmitted by word of mouth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mispronounce something and I pass it on to someone else, and
Yeah.
that person just comes to believe that that is the standard. Now, and
Like
specifically now in English.
zero becomes zero or something like
Huh.
that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, and specifically now in the case of English, like you were talking about, how do you teach English when it's not spoken
Yeah.
around you, right?
Yeah.
So your engagement with English is in the book, through the
Yes.
book,
Yes.
and there are words there that you're reading, and I mean, English is obviously a minefield when it comes to pronunciation,
It's not a
and you
phonetic.
pronounce it however you want to,
Yeah.
because
Absolutely.
you've never heard anyone use that word, and
Yeah.
then that
Yeah.
just kind of stays with you. So
Remains. Yeah.
it remains, yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, see, like everything else, everything about language is standardized, spellings are standardized, so pronunciations are standardized as well. But I think what makes languages interesting are all these variations,
Variations,
variations.
and we must. I think the point that I was trying to make is that we must be a lot more open to those
Open
variations. And
to, yeah,
yeah.
we should not take a very strict view of these things. We
Yeah.
should
Not
understand how these things work, and let it be.
because as you said earlier on, ultimately the point is, are you able to communicate yourself and is the other person or the other set of persons able to understand what you're communicating? Because that, I think, is the bottom line.
It's very important. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very
So if I
important.
say
I think
zero and the other
also
guys
I
figure
think
out that I'm saying zero.
pronunciating,
Yeah.
often I think pronunciation, especially of English, is a hangover from our colonial days.
Yeah. Yeah.
Correct pronunciations in our regional languages definitely have the imprint of caste.
Correct.
The upper caste or the dominant caste pronunciation of the word is the standard. you
Right.
know
Right.
so these are also things to keep in mind.
Right.
The colonial hangover as far as English is concerned, the whole caste angle as far as regional languages are concerned. So
Absolutely.
these are also things to keep in mind.
Absolutely. So, Karthik, we're moving into the last few minutes of this conversation, but I want you to delve, and I think your book talks a lot about uh, this particular issue, which I found very fascinating. The connect between Tamil and Sanskrit, uh, and the and a bit of the politics around that. Both very ancient languages, both claiming that they're older than the other. What is that connect, and what did you find out when you delved a little deeper into this?
No, so there are several things that come to mind about this debate, and which obviously acquired a very, very political color over the
Hmm.
last 100 odd years. Uh, so there was this grand theory that all Indian languages came from Sanskrit, right?
Correct.
And Tamil scholars were among the first to dispute that. They said, no, Tamil
Yeah.
evolved differently, though Tamil also has a number of Sanskrit words in its vocabulary, and there are quite a few Dravidian Tamil words in Sanskrit as well, which is not perhaps so well known. But my mind was cleared by reading this wonderful book, which I would recommend to everyone, called
Hmm.
Tamil A Biography by David Shulman. It's a
Okay.
wonderful book that talks about Tamil, and
Okay.
among other things, it kind of clears the air about
Hmm.
Tamil and Sanskrit.
David
Um,
Schulman, you said, right?
Shulman, yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is, he actually chooses to ignore this debate about Tamil and Sanskrit because he
Okay.
says for hundreds of years, Tamil and Sanskrit coexisted with each other very comfortably without any form of competition or issue whatsoever. So this issue about Tamil versus Sanskrit is a modern day creation, and it is a
Yeah.
fallout of other national and subnational issues. And he says
Hmm.
it's not germane to the debate or the understanding of the language at all.
Right.
So he actually chooses not to engage with it, which I think is an interesting position to take, because he
Hmm.
says it's not important, right? Both these
Hmm.
languages
Hmm.
coexisted, and yes, Tamil has borrowed from Sanskrit, but equally there are Sanskrit words, Dravidian or Tamil words in Sanskrit as well, and that's not so well known, right? One
Yeah, in
instance
fact,
I
I
can
think
give
your
you.
book also talks about certain Tamil words seeping into a very, very ancient text such as Rig Veda, which I found to be very fascinating. I hadn't even known about this,
Yeah.
actually.
For instance, the word for peacock, Mayur,
Hmm.
comes from an old Tamil slash Dravidian word, Mayil. you know.
Ah,
So
okay.
Mayil goes to Sanskrit and becomes Mayur.
Mayur. Okay.
And
Okay.
Mayur in Hindi becomes more.
Right, right. That's the
So
etymology of the whole
that
thing.
is the
Yeah.
etymology. That's how that
Hmm.
word. So I'm
Hmm.
just giving you one instance. I'm sure there are plenty of others. So
Hmm.
these things happen when languages interact with each other. They leak into each other. The best example right now is English is leaking into all our languages.
Absolutely.
In
Absolutely.
large measure.
Yeah. Yeah.
English
Yeah.
is actually a new language that's
Absolutely. And I
being.
think that brings me to some very fascinating passages in your book, which I want to first read a little from and then leave it to you to kind of offer more insights. Um, so, Hinglish, I think, in popular understanding, uh, Hinglish, Hinglish is this very weird or interesting combination of Hindi plus English that we talk about, which many of us believe is more of a Bollywood sort of creation or more of a recent kind of creation. But In your book, you give an example from 1827, which I think is very old, almost 200 years ago, uh, where one of the first poets of India, India's first English poet, whose name is Henry Louis Vivian Derozio, uh, and he writes and he uses English, and there's a great example which I thought I must read out, and I'm quoting now: "Without thy dreams, dear opium, without a single hope I am, spicy scent, delusive joy, chillam hither lao, my boy." I found that extremely interesting. Yeah. So can you enlighten us a little more on English, Karthik?
I mean, this is the first recorded instance of English. So obviously, it had been in use for some years before Derozio put it in a
I'm sure
poem.
it must go much further back in history as well.
I'm guessing it must. No,
Yeah.
I'm certain it must. So I actually like to look at. I like to talk about Hinglish, Hinglish, and English, Inglish.
Okay.
Which
Okay.
is Indian languages plus English. So
Okay.
Tamil plus English, right?
Right.
Kannada
Right.
plus English. That you
Right.
can just kind of give them that bracket term, broad term English,
I think that's a broader
Inglis.
term. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely, that's the broader
Mm.
term. So it's happening, because of the importance of English in our lives. English is seeping into our regional languages, and all our regional languages are now infiltrated with English words, whether or not you like them. You might not, for the moment, use them in formally writing that regional language, but it's there at least in the spoken idiom.
Mm.
uh, and it's a process that began 200 odd years ago, and a process that continues. And
Mm.
I can't imagine how we'd be able to put an end to it. It's just going to
I think it's
continue.
almost effortless, and probably there lies the clue for many of our pedagogues and education policy makers, that encourage this sort of and we learned from Professor Ramakant about code switching and so on, which you also talk about in your book very
Yeah.
extensively. Uh, so the question, therefore, is: do you see? I mean, as somebody who's involved, who has interest in education, can we allow this English, that is, which is Inglis, to become a medium for writing for children? And can it be allowed in things like examinations and so on? Because that could create a greater opportunity for much better
Mhm.
and much more original expression. What do you think?
I mean, I think it's a thought that needs research. You know, will it in some ways compromise pedagogy? Will it mean that children will fall between two stools? That
Hmm.
is definitely one concern,
Hmm.
right? Will it enable proper expression? Will That is another concern. But
Hmm.
uh, since it's happening in front of us, I think it needs research. Right now it's just the language of the street. It's an informal spoken tongue. uh,
Correct.
taking it taking it to the classroom and allowing exams to be written on it, or what's another thing.
Or generally any form of classroom expression which involves speaking or reading or writing. Yeah. I think
Yeah,
somewhere
so
it's there in literature, isn't it? I mean, especially in fiction and so on, you find increasingly, this sort of usage also seeping in.
yeah, it is there. It is there.
Yeah.
You'll see it often in fiction,
Fiction.
because
Yeah.
fiction is
Yeah.
often trying to capture how people speak.
Absolutely.
So I have read Hindi stories with a sprinkling of English.
Yeah. Right.
So
Right. Right.
it's natural, and there are obviously English novels which think nothing of including Hindi or Tamil or Kannada words
Correct.
in
Correct. Correct.
physics.
Absolutely.
So it's all happening. I mean, languages are ever evolving. The language scenario is ever changing. So there's never a dull moment.
What would be your message to anyone who picks up this book? I mean, what is it that you
All I can
want?
say is this is an effort at trying to get you interested in languages, and I hope you'll get interested as a result of this book, and you will go on to think about languages differently. You will perhaps go on to do your own work in understanding languages better. you know and I hope you will look at things like standard language, standard pronunciation, etc., differently. You look at variations kindly, understandingly. That's my biggest hope.
You will admit diversity
Yeah, you will
more
not
sensitively.
worried
Yeah,
about diversity, you will celebrate
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. And I think as we have also learned, as students of language, that the more you are receptive to engaging with different languages, the better you become as a human being, because
Absolutely.
you also begin to appreciate the other person's culture, history,
Absolutely.
and so on. And I think one of the central ideas is that language is a mark of culture, is at the core of culture, is at the core of identity. So I think that's something that and
Absolutely.
I think towards that end, I must say that this book, uh, and I would encourage everyone to pick this up. It's very reasonably priced. Do order it online. It's available on Amazon, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and it's available at your local bookstore as well.
Available at local bookstores. Do pick this up for a fascinating study of uh, languages, with, as I said, some very, very interesting uh, tidbits, facts, and so on, which Karthik has managed to pack in this book. For those who are interested in history, language, children, education, politics, it's all out here. Karthik, the last question: what is your next plan for a book? What are you working
I'm
on now?
actually thinking of a larger version of this book. I am
Okay,
thinking from why not 10 to 25 perhaps. Uh, you
okay.
know,
That makes
more.
it bulkier though.
It will make it bulkier, but more languages in the mix, and therefore more stories, more histories, more interesting facts that will emerge.
Lovely,
Uh,
lovely.
that's what I'm thinking about.
Great. So let me wish you all the best, Karthik, and thank you so much for your time. Uh, I mean, for me, it was a very, very enervating and insightful conversation. And every time I pick up this book, there is something that I learn afresh. There is something that startles me and something that surprises me and something that provides me with a deeper insight. So thank you for this book and thank you for your time, Karthik. Take care.
Thank you for having me on your show, and please don't stop singing and don't stop having interesting conversations.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yeah. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Bye.